This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Juan.
Control of the U.S. Senate hangs in the balance with 3 races still too close to call. Democrats picked up 6 seats on November 4th, building up a commanding advantage to currently control 57 Senate seats to 40 for the Republicans. But 3 key races in Minnesota, Alaska, and Georgia are still not certain, and they could open the door to a filibuster-proof 60-seat supermajority for the Democrats. In Georgia, incumbent Republican Senator Saxby Chambliss fell short of winning the 50% of the vote required for an election under Georgia law. He faces a runoff against former Democratic state legislator Jim Martin on December 2nd. In Alaska, Senator Ted Stevensthe, the longest-serving Republican in Senate history, leads former Anchorage Mayor Democrat Mark Begich by just over 3,000 votes, with about 30% of the ballots remaining to be counted. Stevensthe faces potential expulsion proceedings after his conviction last month of 7 felonies connected to lies on financial disclosure forms. A final vote count is expected next Wednesday. And in Minnesota, the race between incumbent Republican Norm Coleman and Democratic challenger Al Franken is the closest in the country. As of Monday, Coleman leads Franken by a razor-thin 206 votes out of 2.9 million ballots cast. When certified, the results will lead to an automatic recount, which state law says is triggered if the margin of victory is less than half of 1%.
Today, we're going to focus on 2 of the races in Minnesota and Alaska. Paul Demko is a reporter with the Minnesota Independent. He joins us via internet video stream from Minneapolis, and we're joined on the phone from Anchorage by Shannyn Moore, a journalist and former radio talk show host who closely follows Alaska politics. Okay, Shannyn, we're going to go to you first in Anchorage. How is it possible that Alaska still has basically a third of the ballots not yet counted, with, I guess it's Senator Stevens now up by 3,000 votes with the 2/3 that are counted?
Good morning, Amy and Juan. It is difficult for many of us to sort of figure that out, and it's sort of creating a stir around here. There was a remarkable early voter turnout, and we think that most of that was counted with the ballots on the night, election night. But then an additional, about 9,000 showed up there. And then what's curious about this race is that 92% so far of the people who filed for absentee voting turned their ballots back in, and which is a remarkable number. Every couple of days they're finding 10,000 votes. And what's remarkable about that, 2004, I think only 54% turned theirs in.
Now, initially, the polls showed Senator Stevens trailing badly, and yet the count now shows him with a slight lead. Concerns about that as well?
Well, certainly. All of our polls have been remarkably off. Don Young and Ethan Berkowitz. Ethan Berkowitz was, I think, 8 and 12 points ahead of Don Young consistently through the whole race, and now he's 8 points behind. So, you're seeing these 16-point swings. Also, this would be the second lowest voter turnout in Alaska history, percentage-wise. And there's just a whole lot of issues. Basically, you have to believe that the 21,000 people who registered to vote in the last 4 years decided to stay home, and that people who did come out and vote for George Bush didn't feel like coming out for Sarah Palin, and people that came out for John Kerry stayed home and didn't vote for Barack Obama because there's less votes.
Now, Begich was up in the pre-polling at something like 29%, the mayor of Anchorage, 29%. Nate Silver, who does 538.org, who's been remarkably prescient in almost all of .com and almost all of the other races, had this one for Begich 100%.
Right, he did, and he has been remarkably accurate. And I can tell you that just in polling people in Alaska on the ground here, that's what we fully expected. It is a little screwy, and Alaska's known for having some issues here. We do use debold machines. In 2004, the Democratic Party sued to get the tabulator files. It took a year and a half to get those from the state, and when the judge finally ruled that they must turn that information over, well, it was interesting because we couldn't prove that there had been election fraud, but we could prove that the tabulator files, after the judge had ordered them be released, had been altered. And when it came time to find out who had altered them, we found out that the state had just had the password was administration. No, the password was password and the username was administration for every employee that did anything with elections, so you couldn't tell who had done anything. So it just, there's red flags everywhere, and we're just looking close and waiting for the votes today.
And are there any parts of Alaska that are particularly have undervoted, or where the problems are centered?
It seems that it's exactly the same percentages. In fact, it's so close to the same percentages that it's a 61-37 margin on the presidential ballot, which is exactly the same as Bush and Kerry were. So we're looking at that. But I have to say that it's hard to explain to people the sort of nostalgia people have in Alaska for Ted Stevensthe. I mean, here he's been convicted 7 times, but I was born and raised in this state, and Ted Stevensthe was a senator for a couple of years before I was even born. So
that makes sense,
everybody
Shannyn,
has the Ted Stevensthe story.
That makes sense, except that it wasn't reflected in the polls, not even close.
Exactly.
So that kind of sentimentality, which is perhaps understandable, didn't seem to be reflected in the people that were polled. ProPublica has just done a piece, The Mystery of the Missing Alaskan Votes, about what's happened to all the votes. And when do you expect them all to be counted? Because, of course, when you're talking about tens of thousands of votes, that could change the 3,000 margin that Ted Stevensthe has got right now.
Absolutely. It could change a lot of races, including the down-ballot races. They're supposed to be counting 54,000 of the 91,000 left to count today, and we'll see where that leads us. And then they're going to count the remaining, hopefully, on Friday. And it's really frustrating, I know, for a lot of the campaigns who wanted to clean out their offices last week and carry on. And we'd like to know. And I know that Georgia and Minnesota are dealing with the same things.
And when you say the 91,000 still to be counted, if you were using Diebold machines, then these should have been automatic counts, shouldn't they? So are these paper ballots, basically, of absentees or people who voted early?
Alaska uses paper ballots, and they go through the optical scanners, Diebold optical scanners. So there are paper ballots at some point in the majority of places. I think there is some touch screen if people have, special needs that they can't, fill out a ballot. But, yeah, it's strange because the first day they reported 49,000 votes left to be counted. And then the next day they found 25,000 votes, and then the next day they found 10,000 votes. And it's kind of funny. They're writing a new narrative, which is, like Alaskans are mavericky voters, basically, that we've just completely changed our voting pattern. We're familiar
with that term.
What's that?
We're familiar with that term.
Right. Well, it's just like, they're sort of rewriting this whole narrative, like that all of Alaska changed its voting habits within 4-year time, and I don't know what's going on up here. It's really hard to tell because there's so many questions.
Let's go to that issue of the maverick. The Republican senator from South Carolina, Jim DeMint, has served notice that he will seek to expel Stevens from the Republican conference at a November 18th meeting to elect party leaders for the session that begins in January. So let's say Stevens did get elected and he got expelled and there was an open seat. Where does Governor Palin fit into this story?
Well, because of Governor Frank Murkowski, former senator, he became the governor, and the rule then was that you could appoint whoever you deemed fit. He actually nominated his daughter, and she's now our senator. So because of that nepotism that happened there, we created a ballot initiative law pretty quickly. And now there has to be a special election. The governor is to appoint someone in the interim. Well, it's kind of funny, but you can't nominate yourself. So what she'd have to do is step down from her governorship, have her lieutenant governor now, Sean Parnell, who, by the way, is in charge of elections in Alaska, have him put her into that seat for the interim, and she would campaign, and no doubt against Mark Begich. And, you know, yesterday Sarah was talking about how she likes to blaze through doors if God puts a crack in them, and I think she'd go through that one at about 100 miles an hour.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Shannyn Moore, for joining us, radio talk show host from Anchorage, closely following what is happening there.